Eugeniusz Romer, witam Państwa. Zapraszam na kolejną rozmowę Układu Sił. Tym razem jesteśmy na Uniwersytecie Hopkinsa w Waszyngtonie. I naszym gościem jest osoba, która już miała przyjemność występować na łamach naszego magazynu. Mogli Państwo zapoznać się z komentarzem. Jest tą osobą profesor Everett Dolman, który jest profesorem wizytującym tutaj na Uniwersytecie Hopkinsa w Waszyngtonie, ale także jest ekspertem od strategii kosmicznej i autorem książki Astropolitics. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
So my first question is, do you believe that rivalry among great powers is inevitable?
The rivalries are. That war is inevitable or conflict inevitable. Nothing is inevitable. A comet could hit tomorrow or something like that, a solar flare, but it's so highly likely that we have to prepare for it. We have to think about that conflict, how it might play out, and of course, how to try to deter it.
So do you believe this also applies to space?
Absolutely. Space is often considered a completely alien area, but the space around the Earth is part of the warfighting areas of the Earth, whether we like it or not. And so conflict has extended to space almost since the first days after Sputnik was launched in 1957. Within a few years, both the United States and Soviet Union had developed anti-satellite weapons, the SAINT program for the United States. Russia had developed a system that could put a nuclear weapon in space. They did not at that time, but they had developed a system that they orbited as a dummy. And since then, several nations now, to include China and India, have demonstrated anti-satellite capabilities. And so we also have every week hundreds of claims of interference with satellites and space systems. Most of them can be explained away as phenomenon of the weather or orbital perturbations, but a half dozen or 10 every week are apparently direct interference, intended interference, blinding, jamming, that type of thing. So conflict has been going on for some time, and since Vietnam, space support has supported ground operations, and since the Iraq wars with the United States, clearly we've shown that combat operations in modern militaries require space support to be effective and efficient. And so it will be something that is targeted. We have not had a direct battle in space that you could say is a war that's separate, but it's quite possible that could happen, and it's even quite likely given enough time. It's quite likely.
But in your book, which was published more than 20 years ago, you said that at some point the race just stopped. The rivalries just stopped for some reason. Why?
The race, the space race, was between the United States and the Soviet Union. Was part of some of the thoughts that I have on strategy. We had a goal. We had a final area in space, the space race to get to the moon. Once we got to the moon, victory was there. The Russians actually had quit sort of on the way. They'd had some problems with their system. And it was like, okay, we won, now what do we do? And so instead of a race for national prestige, it became how cost effective is it what we're doing? And unfortunately, we put our eggs in a basket of the space shuttle, which had safety problems, and it should have had 1,000 launches by the end of the 20th century. It should have had 10,000 launches by 10 years ago, and in the end, we only had 240 or so, less than that. So it was very cost ineffective. But it looked like the United States was so far ahead with its infrastructure that to compete against that would be vastly too expensive. And so when I was writing in the late 90s and 20 years ago, I wrote that there was a moment in time, maybe 10 or 15 years, where from a realist position, if strength makes peace, deterrence works, that there was a theoretical possibility that the United States could surge a space capability that would prevent others from weaponizing or arming or even effectively fighting in space. And that from that perspective, you could think that was a global good. I also said it had about a 10 to 15 year window before someone caught up. So that's any arming of space is going to be challenged right now, and it is being challenged, and other states are arming space, and the United States is trying to figure out how to respond to that, and it's getting difficult. We also did something very interesting in the 1990s. Prior to that, it was illegal for a private company or an individual to go into space to try to put a rocket into space. And that was very simply because the same vehicles that put satellites into space are the same vehicles that put nuclear weapons on target across continents. And so if someone were to be launching out of their backyard or from a company, it might trigger a war because we don't know, the opponent would have to think it could be threatening. After the Cold War, when it appeared that the United States had won and Russia's space program went into difficulties and the United States ended up buying space capabilities to keep it afloat because it was a great opportunity for international cooperation. At that point, the United States started licensing private companies to go into space, to do things that only the government had done before. And that was because in international law, space is unownable. And so only nations are liable for damages. And so the United States said, we'll license you. If something goes wrong, we will make it whole, we'll make it good. But it really wasn't until the space barons, as they're so-called, the billionaires, something too that had grown up with science fiction fantasies and wanted to get into space, started really coming up with some amazing technological and cost efficiency capabilities that a space race renewed. It was also the rise of China and their desire to be a highly technical state and an understanding of how space could assist them in their industrial rise. So the space race is back on.
I think I will ask you about the rivalry with China later, but I would like to focus on this window, as you said, approximately 10 to 15 years when the US could, let's say, militarize the space itself, but prevents it to be militarized by the others. So is it somehow similar to Bretton Woods system and the free trade? So the freedom of navigation. So the United States provides military help and security on seas, on Earth.
Well, and that's exactly important. The idea that a military in space is dangerous, that it would make others not even want to go to space because of the thought of war, is a misplaced idea. And I was writing against much of that because for some reason, when people look at space and they say, well, here's this pristine area that we can go into as a united humanity and go for the first time into an area that war will not come. But the fact is the military has been in space since its inception. And like the seas, I argued that say you are trading from the Baltic to Shanghai in China, and there was no military presence on the seas, in the open oceans where only the military is legitimate as a use of force in non-sovereign areas. Are you more likely to get to your port without the military blocking, taking care of obstacles, making sure that choke points are open, eliminating pirates and others? Or when there's no military on the oceans, from the British in their dominant area to later to the Americans in their dominant area on the ocean, than if there is actually the military there to help guide and to protect that trade. And it is generally the responsibility of the dominant liberal state to provide those goods for the world. So I started looking at space as no different than the air and the sea in non-sovereign areas. And if we look at it that way, would militarization really be bad? And of course, militarization means military use. So treaty verification is something that's very important with militarization. I think what most people were arguing against was weapons. And so I started saying, well, let's put that on the Navy. The US Navy has the mission to ensure that in times of peace, all peoples can travel there freely for peaceful use. But in times of war, to deny access to the oceans to enemies and to guarantee it for ourselves and our allies. But what if we said to the Navy, no weapons? You cannot use weapons. It would be a ridiculous mission, and you'd have to say, well, we have to do someone else, give it to the State Department, negotiate something. But without weapons, the Navy is meaningless in a military sense. So I made the same thing for space. If there were a benign hegemon, the world leader that could go to space. And since my study of geopolitics and study of space showed me that the choke point of outer space is low Earth orbit, that if low Earth orbit could be seeded with a network of satellites, much like we have in the SpaceX network right now, and do it quickly, and that those had a variety of small weapons on them, that if anyone tried to get into space with nefarious intent, it could be stopped. Also, fortunately, it could also stop missiles launched from one point to another, to include third parties. The recent exchange of missiles and drones with Israel and Iran, could we have made that impossible? But we had a point that we were so far ahead in the early 2000s that we could probably do it quickly. And if, as a liberal trade hegemon, we treated it like the navies, and we said anyone who wants to go there for commercial purposes or for observation, land observation, that we would allow that. That would be fine. We would just try to block any attempt to weaponize as the only holders of weapons. Now, then the question comes: does might make right? Is that something that other states would appreciate or like? No, they would not. But there probably wasn't anything they could do about it at that point. The United States was so far, if it did it quickly. But there's two factors to that for deterrence: is do you have the capability to enforce that, which means you might have to shoot something down that you don't want to shoot down, and do you have the public will behind it? And I argued at the time we don't have the public will. And it would also be against the outer space laws that we had established. So we would have to withdraw from those treaties, and there's a year out on all of those treaties, at which time we do nothing to weaponize. But that would open up a debate amongst the United States people whether we wanted to be the space cop. And I did not think the American people had the desire for that, but it was a theoretical exercise of how it might be done. Now we have to look at how it might be done in an era of competition.
Yeah, so
and
I have a question here to the past. So one may say it could only work if the United States were actually really liberal and, let's say, thinking about other states, and so the others can also benefit from space. But this is, I think one may say this is debatable, because if we look at the Bretton system, so it enabled the US to have access to fuels, for example, from the Middle East, to cheap labor in China or in Asia in general, and also to selling like high-tech, high-end products like iPhones and so on. So it helped the US to maintain technological edge, and like kept the others as a, let's say, co-workers or just a lower developed countries.
Yes, and I cannot deny that America's period of dominance has not had things in it that we should not have done, things that we should not be promoting. But on balance, I do believe that periods of liberal hegemony in history have been peaceful, have been good for trade, and have generally been good for all people. Now, having said that, liberal hegemons, like anyone else, as they start to decline, can become more aggressive. Now, there's two things that are going on here. I have been called an American apologist, and I'll take that a mantle. I do believe that we are not perfect, but we are perfectible. We can get better, and that we think of ourselves as the good guys. Most people do. However, the second thing was, at the time I was arguing, the United States probably can't do that because the political will wouldn't be behind it to take on that mantle. The Bretton Woods system, of course, was necessary after World War II, and was possible because the United States was so strong. The United States had half the world's productive capacity, all of its gold reserves, and had not had its industry shattered in the war. And so the United States set up the Bretton Woods system and basically paid for it. Once by the late 1960s, it became harder for the United States to provide the benefits to everyone. What bothered me about space and this military view of how we could make space available for everyone, of course it's challenged in that, well, everyone really are the Americans not, maybe they'll cheat for themselves. But my real fear was, could an authoritarian state, this would not require the will of the people to sustain it, Could they do it? And if they did it, would they be better curators of space than the United States? And I was thinking of Russia and China. And frankly, I do not think they would be better curators for the world than the United States, as flawed as we have been. And that was part of it. If we don't do it, someone else will. And I still think I still think that is what China wants. If China can dominate space geopolitically, the United States cannot project power from North America. Our entire military capability for operating with on the open seas, defending allies abroad, is based on our ability to use space effectively with modern weapons. If the Chinese can deny space to us, or the Russians can deny space to us, we are stuck. We are defensive only. And so it's a very lucrative idea, an idea that is very persuasive for them to prepare to deny space to us. And so we need to start thinking about, and this is what I've been working on since, defending space assets, having some capability to do that. And technologically, with tremendous advantages in directed energy, I think we can do that without creating debris. I think we can clean up the debris we already have as a navigational, as we do on the seas, to take out navigational hazards, to make that available for all who would go there peacefully. And on balance, as bad as the United States has been, or as good as it's been, it's better than what I imagine would be from an authoritarian state that happens.
So the situation you're describing now, the rivalry between China and the US and Russia maybe, I think on one hand, this is something really hard for the United States because you need to develop technology like very quick. But on the other hand, as you wrote in your book, this is somehow beneficial because this drives actually the technological development, the situation that we have.
Yeah, that technological development is also another problem. Technological development in wartime accelerates very fast and in conflict, but it's for war type of capabilities. Broad development across all kinds of things is best done with a market economy, which is one reason I advocate, not to block the rest of the world from space and just us, but let everyone go into space to develop for trade. Very much like the Bretton Woods system is set on trade, production, free markets, free trade across borders. That's a problem. The free trade does benefit all, but for those largest, most powerful, rich states, it benefits them more. So it's something that a large, powerful, liberal trade state would want to advance and keep going to keep itself in that power position. But real free market understands that the engine of growth is that states get stronger, richer, poor states have advantage, they get richer, it goes in. And when we're talking about security, there's a real fear of the other always, and that those balance has to be in your favor. China has published a number of documents. China's in which they understand that if they can keep the U.S. from using space, and if they can use it, they would have advantage. Space exploration is getting extraordinarily popular. The taikonauts, the astronauts of China, are like rock stars. The science fiction movies are as popular as they could possibly be in literature. The Chinese people are looking very much towards space as a future capability and a future accelerator of their own growth economically, and that's all good. But they're also, I think I've described it in the past as building the capability to create a great wall in space, a great wall of low Earth orbit, following many of the ideas that I spoke about 20 years ago. They seem to be following a similar path in preparation for that. And that causes fear in the United States. The old geopolitical dictum of Thucydides that it was the rise of power of Athens and the fear that caused in Sparta that made the war inevitable. And so in some ways, it's the rise in power in China and the fear that we have in the United States of that, to get to your very first question, that makes conflict almost inevitable, or certainly inevitable from that perspective.
So if we are discussing free markets, I think the main basis is property and security of property. So what the treaties that we have concerning space look at private property? Is it possible to have a part of a moon as a private property and make benefits from it? So it would be an incentive for private companies, but very few companies actually really have those capabilities. So Will it really be a free market?
Well, it can't be under current law. And I've even written on how you might incentivize a free market economy in space, but you would have to rewrite the treaties that we have now or adapt them quite a bit. Nonetheless, there have been some changes. You cannot own, no state can own any territory on celestial bodies. You can't own positions in space. But there are ways to get around that. If you read literally the law, in my view, and I'm not a lawyer, but there's not a lot of space law. It's very easy to read all of it. It says if you do get value from outer space, say you mine an asteroid, and you bring that value back to Earth, you have to share it amongst the world. Now, there's ways of interpreting that, saying, well, if the economy grows and it's a free market world system, of course we're sharing it with the world. But to actually give profits to it is not easy. Now, we've had, for that specific incident, the United States has made domestic law saying that it will allow its companies to go out, mine the stars, and bring the fruits of that back and for themselves. And generally, when the most powerful nations do things like that, international law kind of has to follow. And so it's becoming accepted. The moon is different. The moon is close by, but there are some very, very valuable places on the moon. And we don't know where the resources will be necessary, but we have found water. And water could be used to generate oxygen, which could be used to allow people to live there and study there and to make rocket fuel to go on to Mars and on to other areas if that became valuable. And so there's a principle in international law that if whoever would get there first with a scientific project, that they could declare that the area around that scientific project is not their property, but no one else can build anything there that might interfere with their science. And so how far is that? Is that 5 kilometers? Is that 200 kilometers?
Between sovereignty and a scientific project.
What's the difference if it becomes recognized? So I've actually, with John, a friend of mine, we actually wrote an article that one of the things that could be thought about would be opening up the moon, much as we've done the geostationary belt around Earth, in which there are slots, 3,600 slots. There used to be 360, where a state goes to the United Nations and says, I need 5 slots for a program I want to have, and I want to get that. And you with a lottery, you hand them out. And then as long as you keep using it or keep renewing that, you have that. So we have privatized the geostationary belt for the good of everyone. Could we do the same thing to the moon? Could we make it like an American, when opening up the West, a Homestead Act? Let's divide the moon up into 5,000 equally sized plots.
Yeah, but as you said,
lottery it out.
They have different value on the moon, right?
We don't know what it is. So let's say we then say, okay, well, Cuba, you get 8 lots because a lottery. Some combination of population and size of nation and economic impact, maybe something like that. And you'd say, okay, Poland, you get 55 or 105 or whatever slots. Here's the lottery. If resources are found in your area, someone will want them and they will have to pay you a lease for that to get there. So you could benefit. There's ways of opening it up to a free market, but it would require changing the laws. We'd have to adapt those laws for that. And there's still a lot of concern because who would get the most slots? Who would be the most likely to go out there and actually benefit that from the most? It probably won't happen. It's just an idea.
The countries, they have to agree. So
how do we make space fair for us now? And then, of course, when we do get people there and we get people on Mars, they may say, well, we don't want that system anymore. We want something else. And do they have sovereignty now? From the military perspective, though, frankly, human beings in space are too expensive and too hard to keep alive. And so where we used to think very early on in the late 1950s and 60s, we were developing space planes that would be piloted. Now everything is like RPV or drones. All of our satellites are operated remotely from a spot in the world and far away. All the drones that American flies, military drones that we fly, are operated from Nevada, wherever they are in the world. No drone works without space. And in the war in Ukraine that's going on, for example, we see the Ukrainians have been very innovative and have done really, really innovative things with drones, but without space, they don't work over the horizon.
No, it wouldn't be possible.
They have stopped what we thought would be a week or 10 days of war, and it's now in its third year. It's had a remarkable defense, but it is tough. And then we get to the idea, it was SpaceX that provided them space communications, but that was an individual entrepreneur and not a government. And then as the Ukraine was really putting a dent in the Black Sea fleet, at one point, SpaceX cut off that because it was getting to be too much. And in my view, that's not a decision that should be made by private business. That's a decision that should be made by the presidents of the countries involved.
Ukraine is a perfect example of smaller countries. I wanted to ask, what's the chance of being a part of the space race for countries like Ukraine, but also like Poland? Because we see the division between China and America. We have Artemis Accords. I think Poland joined them.
Yes.
But on the other hand, we have the Chinese-Russian bloc. Mm-hmm. So this is the rivalry, and
this is the race of the 60s now in our age.
So what chances have countries like Poland and Ukraine to be a part of it and to actually benefit it? Because as we spoke before, those ideas are rather, let's say, intellectual exercise. But now we have the reality. What's the reality of Poland, for example?
Well, Poland has a lot of advantages and some disadvantages. And I talk about clarifying the mind. If Ukraine falls and Poland is on the front lines now, it's something I know people are thinking about in Poland. Ukraine was in a position in wartime technology where they had to adapt and they had to get help. They got the help, and now we are learning, and so is everyone, learning that the new wars are going to be quite different, quite dispersed, quite technology and space dependent, unless we go back 50 years to Vietnam era by just eliminating space. And that's one of the big fears, is that a state that is desperate or a state that does not rely on space as much as their opponent may do something to launch weapons into space and just simply try to create as much debris as possible so that no one can use it. And so there's a big fear, and that's one of the things I worry about every day. But for Poland specifically, the free market, again, generally is to the advantage. There are niches that states can take. There are things that South Korea, we see, for example, making huge strides in space, and now providing new technologies and new adaptations to technology, and making softwares from GPS is the great example. The United States Air Force put that into space because there was no business model for it. How would you make a profit off of giving away that signal? So it becomes a government thing to do, where probably the model that solar power from space would have to follow. Build it and they will come. And originally it had two resolutions, a military level resolution and a civilian level, and we would turn that off in times of crisis. And now it's become so integrated into the world economy, we can't turn it off. It is a global public good that the Air Force still pays for and operates. But the resolution has gone from 70 meters at its best down to a meter or so, because private business and free markets have used software adaptations to get that kind of thing. And then ideas, how would you use it? With Uber exists because of it. Just-in-time supply exists. Nobody thought of this. It's adding trillions to the world economy, but it would never have happened if it was a pure business model. So even though you don't need to have a comprehensive space program, launch all the Landsat, communications, GPS. So find your niche and adapt and use what is available. And countries have prospered very, very much that have done it in that way. India is an example of a country that said, we're going to have a comprehensive program as a part of its rise to be very close to what is a great power. They are way bigger, and they now have more people even than China, and an educated population. And so, and Brazil maybe someday would have this capability. A united Europe certainly does. And so Poland being involved in the European space efforts and how they contract that out in percentages based on what you're given, and some states focus on launch, like France, and some other states focus on communications, like Britain, and Italy has a large piece of that pie. It's not prohibitive if you can't have that comprehensive. And frankly, launching people into space is so expensive that the best thing to do is what has been done by the Russians and by the Americans and the Chinese, is to get on board theirs, use them for public, getting the public interested in these things, getting experience, having payload specialists to do different kinds of experiments, becoming mutually dependent on each other. And now, mutual dependence causes mutual vulnerabilities and mutual other things, but it's always been sort of the theoretical idea of the free market that it's comparative advantage. You don't do what you're better than anyone else in the world. You do what you're best at, and you will gain from that. And so Poland, especially with its public, its scientific background, its fascination with space, I think could be a big player in European and then in global.
Yeah, probably the example that you mentioned, South Korean programs, or this is a good direction for us.
They are launching into space themselves now. Yeah.
And they are approximately the same size as Poland in terms of population. Okay,
Yes.
let's go back to, let's say, predicting the future, because we are discussing free market, that this is a good idea to apply to the space, so we can make the best use for the whole humanity of it. But I think free market is the idea associated mostly with the liberal paradigm. And how about realistic paradigm? Because the competition among powers, this is something associated really with So my question is, what's the future? Because we had some similar, let's say, thoughts in back then, 100 years ago. We had Friedrich Ratzel. You wrote about him, the German forefather of geopolitics. So he applied, let's say, Darwin's teachings to social sciences and international relations. So he believed that humanity fights, the nations fight each other for the best places in the world. Yeah. This is something that we are observing in space, I guess, now somehow. And back then it led to Nazi ideology. So do you think this might happen in the future?
Well, it could, and that's why I titled my book Astropolitik. Not that we should follow this model where geopolitics under the German school of geopolitics, and from Ratzel, the idea that a state is an organism and it has to fight to survive, that it goes down that way, but then it also goes down the road that the state that survives is the fittest and therefore superior.
So that's good somehow.
Well, it was good to Ratzel and to Karl Haushofer, and it was certainly good to Hitler because it looked like an action plan for domination. Now, unfortunately, all of the geopoliticians warned, don't have a two-front war, and that was ignored, or at least they put themselves in a position where it was ignored. But the dictums of geostrategy that have existed, take the high ground, take the choke points, control what you can. Get resources where you have them, use the topography. Those still are valid. Those are still very valid, and that idea has been having a renaissance. If we just make sure that don't go down that particular path, I think it'll help. Is it somewhat inevitable? I mean, should the United States dominate space to the point where it's really the clear owner of space? Would that be seen by some as, in the United States, as evidence of superiority and a manifest destiny, as we used to have for colonizing our American West? And so any abuses that we did on the process was good for everyone because it was our destiny. That can happen, and we have to avoid that. The liberal free market idea also, we have to look at that as a liberal. The free market is not something that just comes up naturally and that it's a wonderful thing to happen. And the free market, you have to have a currency system, you have to have a legal system.
Invisible hand.
The invisible hand is not quite as, it's pretty visible actually when you really get into it. But it's based on greed. It's based on, if everyone does what's to their own advantage, that the aggregate will raise. Well, we've shown that. And when we're looking at military strategy and military applications, we can look at the old Cold War and the Soviet Union, United States. The United States built exquisite, expensive, single points of failure satellites The United States built a satellite program that was going to be very successful in peace. The free market works in peacetime to create the greatest number of goods of the greatest variety at the lowest price. It's very effective and efficient. But you get things you may not want. We don't want a free market of nuclear weapons, so we take that off the table, for example. In wartime, though, even the United States will go to a command economy, because what you need is a specific thing in the maximum amounts as quickly as you can get them. And so it creates great war technologies, but is it the best for all of the technologies and the total wealth of the system? Not really. We're blowing things up. But for purposes of survival, even in a war of survival, all states will go to a command economy. So the point is, if you're a good liberal view, astro-liberal you might call it, what the idea is, you want to push off or deter war for as long as possible, so that in peacetime you can take advantage of innovative innovative free market economies. And that's what happened with the United States and Russia. Russia developed a lot of satellites that were heavily shielded. They were launching a lot of them. They didn't have as many functions, but they put more of them up. They were getting ready for a war with the United States, in which war would be fought in space. And it didn't happen. And so the United States was better positioned. Had it happened, we can speculate, but the Russians probably would have won that war in space. That was something I was at US Space Command in NORAD working as an analyst in the 1980s. And the idea was, well, yeah, if we start a war, we're going to have to fight without space because they're going to get it. And we just didn't even think about it. We just weren't ready for it. And now, in a more competitive world, the U.S. Space Force, for example, has declared that space is a warfighting domain, and that we know that in a war it's going to be contested. And so we have to think about how we will defend those assets and provide the support that the world needs, the military needs, even in a contested environment. 5 years ago, if you were in uniform, you could not use the words space and war in the same sentence. It was a touchy subject. Today, with recent developments, especially threats to space because of a desperate situation, because of what we see as some very strange things happening with satellites on orbit. For example, the Russians seem to be setting, almost like a Matryoshka doll, a little satellite comes out of a bigger one, and then the little one comes out, or what appears to be possibly a projectile is used. And just by the way an orbit is set up, by the maneuvers that are done, it's hard to say if a weapon is out there or not. And so we have to start preparing. How would we defend from that? Because we have to. If space were suddenly to go away, say there was a massive solar flare or something, or a huge amount of debris was caused to where no one could use space, the global economy would collapse. Trillions of dollars every day go through cyber internet commerce, go through bank transactions, stock market transactions. Our power grids, switch stations because of that. Our cell phones work based on space. Our supply systems are all short now. We don't have mountains of reserves because we don't need them. We know from creation to sale where every part is and where we need it. That goes away. And militarily, for the United States at least, all of our forward assets have to crouch down defensively and wait until we can build up a capacity to fight without space. It would be absolutely disastrous. So, we have to try to make sure it doesn't happen. We have to try to deter. We have to try to make cooperative agreements like Artemis Accords, do more things, although Artemis itself is now a space race with the Chinese-Russian one. But we have to try to make sure that war does not happen. For a realist, if you want peace, prepare for war. A liberal thinks that if you prepare for war, you're going to get it because you're preparing for it, and it makes it more likely. What the realist will say, and what I've said, well, if you want a war, don't do anything in space. Somebody will go up there and challenge you, and you'll get one. These are assumptions we make about the world around us. And so for a liberal or a socialist or now the new constructivist, which is a variant in my view of liberalism, but that liberal-realist divide, you have different assumptions about what People are basically good, people are basically acquisitive, people are basically bad, whatever it is. And from those assumptions, your outcomes flow. So you have to look at both things. Is there a middle road that takes some of this and some of that? That's what we're all searching for.
I would say this is our as you said, this is when you look at the world around, you use this phrase. So when we are in space, I think when we look at the world, it's so small, and this is completely changes the perspective, I think. So I would like to ask you about the future, or I don't know if it's very future or maybe not so distant future, because some private entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, they claim they are going to build colonies on Mars or orbital cities orbiting the Earth. So you wrote in your book about how technology or military, I don't know, formations change the social relations among social groups and nations. So how do you think humanity will look like in the future when some people will be, let's say, colonizing space and some people will live still on Earth? Because those people will even change, like physically, they will look different.
Yes.
So there will be so many differences.
Well, we're really looking. They'll also be hooked into computers. They'll have cyborg implants. We're looking possibly at post-humanity. As a military strategist for the U.S. Space Force, among others, I have to look 10 years out. Where are we going on that? But I love speculating farther. And one of my great mentors, Daniel Dudney, is very leery of us going out. And I think Elon Musk has actually said it. I don't know, maybe I'm misplaying. Part of it is because we think the world is screwed. That's a terrible phrase, but that with climate change and with population, that it's doomed. And so we need to have colonies so that the species survives. And Dan will tell you that the problem with that is it gives you an out. Now we don't have to save the world if we have that. We can let the earth, we can make the earth die. We can let all of our worst impulses happen. So this is something that is a really valid argument that I think we need to think through. His point is we should not go into space until we fix the earth. My position is we can't fix the earth without space. And so it's a conundrum, to be sure, but I understand the logic of that position. People will change. People will, as we get farther away. Right now, everything we can do around the earth up to the moon, we can do robotically. Once we get past Mars, it's an hour, 2 hours between communications back and forth. You'll have to have humans on the scene or really good AI that you trust. And that becomes a problem too. The people will be different. We may be 50 years from recognizing that Homo sapiens is now Homo spacians. I don't know what we'll think about it, but it's going to change.
Mm. Thank you, sir. It was extremely interesting to listen to this, to your answers. So I hope we will see it together, how the space and Earth will look like in the future. Thank you. Moim gościem był profesor Everett Dolman, autor książki Astropolitics, specjalista od strategii kosmicznej i aktualnie profesor wizytujący na Uniwersytecie Hopkinsa w Waszyngtonie. Mam nadzieję, że podobała się Państwu ta rozmowa. Zachęcam do tego, żeby subskrybować kanał Układu Sił po więcej takich treści. Dziękuję Państwu i do zobaczenia.